My name is James Murch. I live and work in the seaside town of Plein in Torbay, Devon. My painting practice revolves around the tradition of en plein air or open air painting, the emphasis being on working from life. These trips can range from 2 to 4 hours at one time. Sometimes several visits are required to complete a painting. These often smaller studies can help in developing larger paintings carried out in the studio. Passers-by will sometimes ask me why I don't just take a photograph. And while I don't object to using photography, it can never come close to the benefits of working from life. Not just to the end result of the painting, but to the overall development of the painter. In previous years, I would spend hours lugging painting gear around trying to find that perfect viewpoint. With experience, I've learnt to be more curious about my immediate surroundings, and I've built a library of painting spots for different times of the day. There are places that I paint now that I would have walked right by in the past. I mix a 50-50 raw umber and vine black, perhaps with a spot of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to get a rich dark. My medium is a 1-to-1 mix of distilled gum turpentine and poppy seed oil, which I use quite sparingly. A viewfinder helps me to make a mental note of the boundaries of the painting. My painting always starts with a scumbled in, to the point of being barely readable ghost of an image. I like complex and challenging subjects where there are a lot of overlapping forms. I'm often zooming in on a small pocket of interest which I sometimes have to exaggerate in scale to get what I'm after. I find working proportionally is invaluable. That's being able to read height-width proportions as opposed to sight sizing, which is a very literal like-for-like transfer. It takes a bit of effort to ingrain it, but I've found it to be very useful. The subject I choose will ideally have a pattern of light and dark that is striking, or lots of forms that I can get stuck into. It's going with that first thing that has interested me and I try to hold on to. There was a tendency early on to think that to be a landscape painter I had to travel. These days I think I would be quite happy just painting the same handful of places over and over. It's easy to think the grass is greener somewhere else. I would also be in good company. Giorgio Morandi spent much of his career painting the same bottles, vases and bowls. The challenge for the painter, and I suppose any creative person, is to find our own way of seeing, and I think it comes down to just being more careful about looking. Stepping back and taking in the painting as a whole is a good way of checking that I'm not deviating and that the painting reads well. I like forms and transitions over planes described with single brushstrokes, sometimes manipulated with a finger. I'm always impressed by paintings that have this quality. I've experimented with detailed drawings before, but I find I end up with more of an illustration and the feeling and mystery is lost. I believe it's about giving just enough information, but letting the viewer be involved and allowing them to complete the image without overwhelming with too much detail and information. I don't use store-bought canvases or panels. I prefer to play around with the geometry, using phi and root 2 rectangles and so on. What fascinates me are the similarities between phi's ratio and that of natural forms. There is an infinite crystalline mirroring of proportions. I recently went to an exhibit of works by William Blake, who wrote, "To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour." I like to think he was referring to that same phenomenon. I try to place elements of the painting on the invisible construction lines that make up these shapes. I think it's built into our DNA, so I don't think it's lost on the viewer. I think it's felt in some way. I use a pretty consistent palette of about 12 or 13 colours, plus black and white. There is a cool to warm scale within each of the primaries, so I find having a few of each is enough. I prefer then to mix my secondary hues of orange, violet, green from my primaries. I think it adds to the harmony and helps develop a deeper understanding of colour mixing. As it happens, these secondary colours form a harmonic triad within the colour wheel, which is very useful for landscapes. So I often use this as a starting point. I mix these three pools of colour and modify them as I progress through the painting. I sometimes contrast this with a few notes of an opposing triad, such as red, yellow, blue for this example. When the colour balance of the entire painting is right, a neutral grey is created in the mind's eye, and an equilibrium and sense of order is felt by the viewer. What I find fascinating is that nature seems to do this balancing act, and so really I'm just learning to see what has already been done by a far superior hand. I experiment with changes in value, light versus dark mixtures, and chromatic greys, which is the mixture of complements, placing them in such a way that guides the viewer through the painting, remembering that visually saturated and warmer colour notes advance, unsaturated and cooler notes recede in space. The defining characteristic of colour is that it reacts to what is put beside it. So I work the painting up as a whole by blocking in the local colour of each area first, and then I go back and make refinements. This approach helps to prevent sudden unwanted effects. I enjoy playing around with saturation, warm versus cool, complementaries, simultaneous contrast, and so on. Never with the thought to improve on nature, but more with the understanding of the limitations of paint on a two-dimensional surface. For me to feel the painting has been a success, it has to stand on its own, regardless of its likeness to the location. The location acts more as a guiding hand to this point.